Finally, the Fed is using the dreaded R word now, recession. I'll explain this in the video and what it means to us because it's time to batten down the hatches if you haven't already done so. Plus, Russia may be looking to implement another mass mobilization and is firing missiles off along with North Korea. China continues to threaten neighboring countries from the Philippines to India, and there are some developing diseases that you might want to keep a close eye on. Plus, another great giveaway in this video edition of the news that you need to know. Now, before we jump in, I typically do a kind of a personal discussion at the end of my videos, and I'm going to move it up to the beginning before we get into the news. I know there's a lot happening, and I know there's a lot that feels like the world's on fire and that we need to, get ready for the worst. I do these news segments to try to keep you informed, not to get you in a state of fear. And I always try to balance this channel out with practical information to give you options on how to prepare. Now, in saying that, I think as I've learned many times in life, when things are uncertain or there's a lot of change swirling around you, those are usually not the times to make rash decisions that could alter your life in severe ways. And I say that because it's in these moments like this when so much uncertainty is happening, when there's a lot of, again, craziness swirling around us. Those are usually times that I don't make major decisions, but instead I try my own personal life to steady the boat in the middle of the storm. And I know that's kind of the feeling that it feels like right now, that there's this storm swirling around us. And my encouragement to you before we jump into the news is try to steady your own boat. Try to find ways to calm your own life, take actionable steps, make decisions on where you want to be a month from now, 2 months, 3 months. But my encouragement to you is don't make major decisions that will have profound impacts on your life because you fear something may happen. We have no idea what's coming next. But for me, whenever I feel that sense of anxiety rise up, I've learned to tame it over the years. And I've learned to say, look, I have no control over what comes next. All I can do is put my hand to the plow, so to speak, focus on what's in front of me, prepare, develop the skills that I need. I'm going to be working on gardening very extensively over the next few months. It's not fun or exciting, but it needs to be done. And so that's for me what I know needs to get done. So in conclusion here, don't allow yourself to get caught up in fear or anxiety at this time. Pay attention to what's going on around you, but focus on the task at hand and find personal goals for you, whether that's to store more water, store more food. But this is not the time to allow yourself to get caught up in fear and anxiety and to make these major life decisions that could alter you if nothing happens. So that's my final encouragement to you. So let's jump into the news. Recession. Well, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. central bank composed of policymakers, is now acknowledging what we and others have been pointing out for over a year now. The U.S. economy is going to enter a recession. Now, the Fed reluctantly is laying all that blame almost entirely on the recent banking turmoil and not the double-digit inflation, a war in Ukraine, tensions with China, or slower than expected recovery from the COVID pandemic. Now, at least they came around to finally acknowledging this fact, though. Now, their actual projection now is for a mild recession starting later this year with the recovery of the subsequent 2 years. They indicate that this will be accompanied by a jump in the unemployment rate and predict a full recovery in a little over 2 years. Now, in many ways, we are experiencing compounded inflation already. And yes, there is the banking crisis, but a host of other problems have hammered away at the economy and its long-term forecasts. At the Fed's March meeting, they projected that the economy would grow by only 4%. That is a rate so slow that any other factor, and there are plenty to choose from, could easily cause that projected growth to evaporate or dip negative. This current forecast by the Fed will lead to a tightening of credit and lending by banks as they look to limit their exposure and minimize their risk. The Fed has hoped to avoid that by acknowledging a recession earlier. Now, in their defense, they actually didn't even need to really recognize a recession at this point, as the state unemployment benefits rose slightly, but were still historically low. The economy still has a lot of fuel, but there isn't much optimism to keep that fire stoked. State unemployment benefits rose to a seasonably adjusted 239,000 unadjusted new claims. Economists put the breach point that would signal a deterioration in the labor market at around 270,000, so we aren't technically there by any technical definition of a recession. The rate hikes do seem to have slowed inflation considerably. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, climbed just 0.1% last month. Some items tumbled off their dramatic highs. Egg prices fell 10.9%. Meat, fruits, and vegetables all declined from their recent highs. And these are slight declines, however, in response to massive increases. As inflation goes, prices get driven up to new highs, but they rarely, if ever, return to their original price before inflation. While most of these grocery price decreases are great news for regular consumers like you and me, they weren't across the board, and there are still some things to keep an eye on in the future. Mainly, you want to watch for increases in milk and grain prices. The coming recession also means that we will likely even see more inflationary pressures driving up prices. Some of these cost increases will be real and reflect the new realities of production, supply, and transportation expenses. Some of these price increases will be more opportunistic or even intentionally gouging. Whichever side of the coin they do end up falling on, the takeaway here is that things will continue to rise in price over at least the next 2 years. And if you haven't downloaded our recession-proof guide, which is free, we just released one last year. It might be a good time to do so now. I'll post a link to it in the comments and description section below. I'll also link to some other videos on surviving a recession or other economic downturn in the comments below as well. Also, watch next week sometime for our video on how this recession will be like no other before it could potentially mold an entire generation. You can subscribe to this channel to be alerted when that video is released. Now, the slow inflation numbers for the last month and the acknowledgement that a recession is inevitable will likely encourage the Fed to really slow down its rate hikes. Many economists anticipate just one more hike of another 25 basis points. Financial markets and banks, too, are betting that the Fed will increase rate hikes by another 25 basis points, and that likely will be the last rate hike the U.S. central bank's fastest monetary policy tightening campaign since the late 1980s. Now, these rate hikes force banks to be more conservative with their money. It also means that a potential APR increase for your credit cards or loans. It can also mean that a loan for any purchase, whether that's a small business to a home, is harder to get and with more conditions that need to be met. Still, it's essential to keep the Fed's small but aggressive interest rate hike in perspective. The Fed is in the 5% territory now, and that's far from the 20% of the 1980s. It's lower than Russia's 7.5, Venezuela's 57, or Argentina's 78. In fact, it puts interest rates right in the middle of the G20 nations. And while telling you again that we're heading into a recession, it is also fitting to let you know that the federal deficit topped $1 trillion in the first 6 months of fiscal 2023, October through March. And you're going to hear more and more about this as politicians try to wrangle on the Hill about whether to increase the debt ceiling, how, and by how much. Now, I mention it here because the coming conflict over this will continue to erode consumer confidence and will further pump the brakes on the economy. Barring a resolution of the disputes with Russia and China, more things can go wrong than they are going right. I would encourage you to prepare your finances as you do your food and water, because the economy here and worldwide will decline steadily for at least the foreseeable future. Russia, Ukraine. Though U.S. officials have neither confirmed nor denied the authenticity of the leaked documents, they detailed 4 wildcard scenarios that could occur in the Russian and Ukraine conflict. Now, one of those involves the death of Zelensky. Another addresses the possible death of Putin. Each would obviously change the trajectory of the conflict. And the other 2 wildcard scenarios detailed in the document address the possible scenario of Ukraine using long-range missiles to strike the Kremlin and shifts in Russian military leadership. Now, if the documents are authentic, they point to substantial intelligent leaks. Even if they aren't genuine, there's no doubt analysis in the Pentagon have considered these scenarios. Russia's parliament passed a new measure to penalize anyone trying to skirt conscripted military service. Some think this is in advance of a Ukrainian counteroffensive and another massive mobilization, though the Kremlin denies that at this time. Now, the measure before the Russian parliament would move the conscription process to the same electronic system used by Russians for online public services, such as registering births, applying for a passport, marriage license, paying bills or fines, and even booking doctor appointments. So, avoiding it to dodge a draft would be very difficult. Russian citizens who fail to show up for service by the 20th day of their online delivery of their summons could be banned from even driving a car. Now, the current method of conscription sends people out to try and find all the men not showing up within their conscription papers time frame. The changes provide that summons can be sent to Russians in writing with a receipt, by registered mail with a return receipt, as well as digitally. In the case of a digital summons, it can be considered delivered from the moment it is placed in the personal account. Now, the electronic system would be able to stop all public services to any individual failing to show up on the 20th day after the notice has been served. And that notice to serve would now be entirely electronic. The swiftly introduced draft changes demonstrate that regular Russians are being drawn into this conflict, and this will add pressure on Putin if he opts to have another mobilization. It's much easier to wage war with people drafted out of prison or the remote countryside than it is to conscript middle-class citizens from St. Petersburg or Moscow. Thousands of Russians have avoided the draft to escape the war in Ukraine, and some men who protested the invasion of Ukraine were initially served draft papers and told that they could fight in Ukraine or go to prison. Aside from the actual casualty count on the battlefield, the human cost of the war in Russia is real. The number of young workers in Russia has dropped to one of its lowest levels in the country's post-Soviet history. Unlike younger workers, Russians of pre-retirement age have flooded the job market after highly controversial pension reforms in 2018 raised the country's retirement age. It's clear that Russia is switching to a wartime economy, anticipating a long drawn-out conflict in Ukraine. Perhaps most alarming for Russia has to be the declining birth rate. Casualty estimates of Russians are as high as 250,000 dead or wounded, and there was a mass exodus of thousands of young men fleeing conscription during the first mobilization, and the mortality rates from COVID-19 were one of the worst in the world. The life expectancy of Russian males aged 15 is currently at the same level as those in Haiti. It's safe to say that all those factors do not encourage a country's healthy birth rate to keep the economy going. Recent numbers even show that birth rates declined to 3,358 births a day, but the country has a daily death rate of 3,633. While that is only a decline of 300 lives per day, it is exacerbated by the exodus and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Even if Russia were to win the day in Ukraine, the economic impact of this decline will have repercussions for decades. We reported earlier this week that satellite imagery had revealed that Russians had built a 45-mile trench. New imagery has shown a very extensive network of trenches in the area where the Russian-occupied region of Crimea connects with Ukraine, suggesting Russian concerns about a possible Ukrainian attack there. Now, Russia continues to dig in far from the front lines to brace for a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, while Ukrainian forces will assuredly encounter minefields, anti-tank ditches, and other obstacles, the effectiveness of trenches in an age of precision attack drones will be tested before this conflict is resolved. In a video that expresses the depravity and horror of this war, a video purportedly showing the beheading of a Ukrainian prisoner of war, if confirmed, was recently released, prompting Ukrainian President Zelensky to ask world leaders to condemn the action. Now, he pointed out that this was not a one-off brutal incident. This violence could be seen in Bucha and around areas where Russian occupiers have tortured and killed Ukrainians by the hundreds and thousands. Ukraine's foreign minister said that the video with the supposed brutal execution of a Ukrainian POW emphasizes the need to exclude Russia from the UN Security Council, over which it presides, and the organization in general. European and UN leaders have reacted with a more tempered response by emphasizing that the killing prisoners of war is a very serious breach of the Geneva Convention and demonstrates once more Russia's complete disregard of international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. Now, in other news, both Russia and North Korea have conducted intercontinental ballistic missile launches last week. North Korea's missile was launched at a high angle near the North Korean capital and fell between the Korean peninsula and Japan following a 620-mile flight. Japan briefly sounded alarms and urged its citizenry to take immediate shelter. North Korea has launched about 100 missiles since the start of 2022, many of them nuclear-capable weapons that place the U.S. mainland, South Korea, or Japan within striking distance. And the Russian intercontinental ballistic missile was launched from a test site in the Russian Federation and reportedly hit its target at a test site in Kazakhstan to the east. With the missile launched to the west from the same Russian military base, it would have been in range of Warsaw, Poland, and that was probably the reasoning behind the launch. Now, the next economic sanctions against Russia are being directed at its liquid natural gas industry. Those sanctions were placed on seaborne natural gas and oil. Europe faced a harsh winter and was reluctant to put any sanctions on Russia's LNG industry. As a result, Russia supplied Europe with some 17 million tons of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, last year, up an incredible 20% from 2021 volumes. This has cut into Russia's profit significantly, but still resulted in a net profit of 747 billion rubles in the Russian war coffers. Now that warmer weather is settling in across Europe, there's going to be a renewed push to sanction this money-making Russian industry. The Netherlands ceased creating new contracts for Russian LNG imports this year and is seeking to nullify pre-existing contracts. Many European countries are going to likely follow suit, but without any official sanctions being implemented, countries are going to face heavy penalties for breaching existing contracts with Russia's fossil fuel giant. Now, meanwhile, Europe became the primary destination for U.S. LNG exports in 2022, accounting for 64% of total exports. And let me tell you, the last few months I've been feeling it in my gas bill. We will all be hearing more about LNG from Russia funding the Russian war effort in the coming warmer months when the dependency is decreased. And finally, on the Russia-Ukraine front, South Korea has committed to lend the U.S. 500,000 rounds of artillery shells. The 155mm artillery shells will provide Washington with greater flexibility to supply Ukraine from its own arsenal. South Korea is lending the ammunition and has carefully chosen that terminology as it allows them to reduce the chances of its artillery shells being directly introduced into the war in Ukraine. But still, it also allows the U.S. to support the war from its own supply. And South Korea, a key U.S. ally and significant producer of artillery ammunition, says it cannot provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, citing its own security situation amid evolving nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. Now, this lending of ammunition has really only come to light due to the leaked, highly classified U.S. military documents. China. Germany is meeting with China this week, and their stance is already firmer than was exhibited by French President Macron last week. We covered Macron's response in our video earlier this week, and some analysts say that Mr. Macron's comments were that the U.S. is to blame as much as China for the rising tensions over Taiwan, making it harder for the EU to take a harder line with Beijing. Now, Germany has been more forceful, accusing China of ratcheting up tensions with its recent military drills around Taiwan. Berlin's comments came immediately ahead of a top-level diplomatic visit to Beijing. Now, China on Monday ended 3 days of military exercises conducted in response to a visit by Taiwan's president to the United States last week. Like Macron, Europe doesn't want to see a change in the status quo over Taiwan. Speaking ahead of her visit, the German foreign minister emphasized the top of her agenda would be reminding China of its responsibility to influence Russia to end its invasion of Ukraine, and underlying a common European conviction that a unilateral change in the status quo in the Taiwan Strait would be unacceptable. Taiwan's foreign minister, Joseph Wu, condemned Beijing's actions and warned that they seem to be trying to get ready to launch a war against Taiwan. Now, I'm sure it feels that way for Taiwan's foreign minister and the people of Taiwan, but China's recent drills are more bluster than an ominous foreboding of an invasion to come. And through the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. is legally obligated to provide Taiwan with defensive weaponry. But still, officials typically remain deliberately vague on whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan in the event of an attempted Chinese attack. And there's still much vagueness in this potential conflict because both the United States and Chinese economies are really too intricately dependent upon one another. Now, while BRICS may one day change that, and any conflict flaring up amidst current tensions is possible, conflicts will likely be more tempered so long as this codependent relationship exists. Now, part of the core issue in this rising conflict is the Taiwan Strait in the South China Sea. Ships, including U.S. vessels, test China's authority, and most recently, the U.S. Navy has sent a destroyer close to the contested island in the South China Sea that Beijing has fortified with military installations to stake its territorial claims on the region. And these actions are commonplace against superpowers, as Russian ships have been spotted near Hawaii, and Russian and Chinese vessels have been jointly deployed in the United States' exclusive economic zone around Alaska. Each incident, whether at sea or in the air, has the potential to escalate uncontrollably. Chinese President Xi Jinping continued to push for an escalation of the conflict, calling on the country's armed forces to strengthen military training oriented toward actual combat. Now, Xi told the People's Liberation Army, Southern Theater Command Navy, that the military must resolutely defend China's territorial sovereignty and maritime interests and strive to protect overall peripheral stability. Beijing is also enraged by a plan for the U.S. forces to use a growing number of bases in the Philippines, including one near Taiwan, which we also reported on in our video earlier this week. Now, top defense and diplomatic officials of the United States and the Philippines agreed to complete a roadmap in the coming months to deliver U.S. defense assistance to the Southeast Asian nation over the next 5 to 10 years. Japan has slightly altered its position in the area to implement a plan that will provide like-minded Asian countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Fiji with security assistance. And this is a slight paradigm shift in Japan's foreign policy. And while the budget claims are relatively small, at a mere $15 million, it does still signify Japan's willingness to interject its forces into any future conflict that may emerge. In a letter to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Chinese President Xi Jinping stated that he attaches great importance to the relations between the two parties and the two countries, and he expresses wishes to accelerate the development of the socialist cause of both countries and promote regional peace, stability, development, and prosperity through a reinforcement of the strategic guide of bilateral relations. But not all of China's neighbors are really thrilled with China right now. The Indian military expressed serious concerns over massive construction by China in the Amochu River Valley in Bhutan. Now, this border zone was hardly patrolled by either Chinese or Bhutanese forces before 2017. In 1960, the Chinese government issued a statement claiming that Bhutan, Sikkim, and Ladakh are part of the unified Tibet. Now, Xi's recent push for One China may also include bringing these regions under tighter, more direct Chinese control. So what do you think? Will it be business as usual with Taiwan, China, India, and the nations of the South China Sea, or are we heading into a much broader conflict in the years ahead? Will this potential China and India conflict prevent BRICS from developing any further? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Giveaway. For this week's giveaway, we're going to be giving away a 5-pack of permanent matches. To be eligible for a chance to win in this giveaway, just simply post a comment below and click the like button. And for the video next week, I'll use the tool to draw a winner from the comments on this video randomly. For the last video's winner of the Emergency Radio 5000 hand crank solar weather radio, the winner is a subscriber, Eric Hoffman. I'll reach out to you shortly to get that sent to you. Diseases. A new variant of COVID-19 dubbed Arcturus is behind a 13-fold surge in infections in India. This week, case numbers throughout India rose by 3,122 in a single day. And the country's Ministry of Health officially recorded over 40,000 cases of active COVID infections this week. Now, the Arcturus strain has one more spike protein, which in labs showed increased infectivity and potential increased ability to cause a disease. And there has been no reported change in the severity of the strain, but it is something to keep an eye on right now. Now, another disease, the Marburg virus, is currently having 2 simultaneous outbreaks, one in the Equatorial Guinea and the other in Tanzania. Now, the two countries are on opposite sides of the continent. The Marburg virus is as deadly as Ebola, which is closely related, but it has been extremely rare until now. There have been 8 cases in Tanzania and 15 confirmed cases in Equatorial Guinea, sufficient for the World Health Organization and the U.S. Center for Disease Control to issue health alerts and warnings to doctors. Now, the most significant 2 outbreaks of Marburg were 154 cases in the Democratic Republic of Congo and 252 in Angola. And both of these outbreaks occurred over 20 years ago. What is unique about this recent outbreak is that it is not isolated to one area. Also of note is the fact that there was no post-infection vaccine or treatment for the virus, which has a close to 50% fatality rate. As scary as that is, people shouldn't expect that this virus is going to travel far and wide and fast as the coronavirus did. The symptoms are more obvious, the incubation period after exposure is shorter, and the Marburg virus is relatively stable and less apt to mutate. We're going to continue to monitor this for any signs of a larger outbreak. Now, as we come into contact with wildlife, the chances of an infection increases. China is now reporting the first human death from H3N8 bird flu. And this strain of avian influenza is rare in humans. And this doesn't signify a broader virus jump to humans, though. The woman had multiple underlying conditions, a history of exposure to live poultry, and samples collected from a wet market visited by the woman before she became ill was positive for the virus. And there was no other cases found among close contacts of the infected woman. These are really all reminders to keep preps in your supplies to address a possible viral outbreak. From prevention to treatment of symptoms, you should have personal protection equipment and cold and flu medications and remedies ready to go. You'd also be wise to establish a plan to follow in case of an outbreak of any disease in or near your area. What do you think? Will these outbreaks change any of your core preps? Will we see more of these as wild zones shrink and exposure incidents increase? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As I stated at the beginning of the video, as with anything happening in the world today, you can either let the news inform your prepping decisions and directions, or you can feel overwhelmed. In any crisis, cooler heads always prevail. So I hope you will choose to let this information direct the course of your preps. As always, stay safe out there.